I'm Deanna Carden from the Central Georgia EMC in Jackson, Georgia. Welcome to Along Those Lines.
Support for this podcast comes from NRECA Broadband, a specialized service offering that helps electric co-ops succeed in the broadband business. We're leveling the playing field in Washington and positioning co-ops as a crucial force in rural broadband.
Hi, everyone. This is a podcast about electric cooperatives, the work they do, and the challenges they face. I'm your host, Scott Hoffman. The long-simmering dispute in the Pacific Northwest over management of the 4 Lower Snake River dams burst into the headlines in late 2023 with the leak of a backroom deal between the Biden administration and the plaintiffs in a lawsuit against Bonneville Power Administration and the other government agencies that manage the dams. The deal, which has now become a formal memorandum of understanding between the parties, was done without the input of key interests, including irrigation, shipping, and hydropower industry, and has raised fears about the possibility of breaching the dams and compromising the availability of reliable, carbon-free electricity at a time when demand in the region is set to skyrocket. To discuss the history and the on-the-ground impacts of this major development, we'll talk with Louis Finkel, NRECA's Senior Vice President for Government Relations, and Bryan, the CEO of Fall River Electric Cooperative in Idaho. Louis, welcome back to the podcast. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Scott. Always my pleasure.
All right, let's start at a high level. What are the Lower Snake River dams? Where are they, and what do they do?
In the Pacific Northwest, 80% of the capacity that exists for electricity from the Bonneville Power Administration is hydroelectric dams. What is commonly referred to as the Columbia River system has a series of 31 dams across the Pacific Northwest, mostly in Washington, some in Oregon. And these dams are what provide the bulk of the power to our electric cooperatives, but also to municipal utilities in the region. On the Lower Snake River, there are 4 dams. So the Lower Snake River sits in the southeastern corner of Washington, almost down to the Washington-Oregon border. And there are 4 dams that provide reliable, affordable, stable supply, about 3,000 megawatts of electricity. They are critically important dams that maintain reliability in the region, provide stable power supply, but also all this hydroelectric power in the Northwest, it ensures affordability, creates downward pressure. So these dams are a critical source of electricity for the region and for our members.
And there has been sort of simmering issues around these dams in the Northwest for many years. Talk a little bit about what the conflict is that's sort of surrounding them.
About 20 some odd years ago, lawsuits were filed in the region against the federal government, specifically on the Endangered Species Act, trying to push for the removal of these Lower Snake River dams because the Lower Snake River is spawning ground for steelhead and salmon. Those lawsuits were filed by environmental NGOs and by tribal nations in the region. So since that time, and since these lawsuits were brought, the river system has effectively been managed by a judge. The outcome of these lawsuits hasn't been resolved. There's been pending litigation for more than 20 years. So the judge has been overseeing the operation of the rivers, which includes these dams, but also recreational facilities. There's a bunch of Corps of Engineers operations. And so what has been happening since that time has been hundreds of millions of dollars each year is spent by ratepayers, consumer members of co-ops in the region for all sorts of mitigation measures and all sorts of measures to allow for spillover, meaning more water is going over the dam or around the dam rather than through the electric turbines. And there have been ongoing efforts to try to create opportunity for bringing back the salmon and steelhead population. And by the way, that has happened. A lot of the mitigation measures that our members have paid for, that BPA has put forward, that have been done in a collaborative, transparent way, and I use those words now because we're going to talk about that later, but in a transparent and clear way where investments have been made by consumer members all over the region, all over the 4-state, 8-state region that receive power from Bonneville. That money has been pumped back into salmon mitigation and wildlife and habitat restoration.
Okay, so the conflict you've been talking about that's sort of been simmering in the background for many years, came to a head fairly suddenly with a media report late last year that the Biden administration had made some deal with the litigants in this lawsuit. Why don't you tell us what's in that actual agreement and how did this story come out?
Around a year ago, we as NRECA in the Washington world of advocacy, but also a bunch of our members and our statewide partners in the region started hearing noise that the White House was getting involved in these conversations about what to do about the dams, right? And this is not a new topic, right? As you and I already talked about, for 20 years there's been litigation. And frankly, elected officials, non-elected officials have been trying to find a way to thread the needle to find a compromise, find balance. There's been study after study after study on whether these dams should be removed or breached. What other mitigation can we bring into play to help restore the fish population and some of the ecosystem management out there? So a year ago, we started hearing that the White House is getting involved in these conversations through an obscure office that most folks have never heard about called the Council of Environmental Quality. They started engaging in some of the discussions for the region. And all the while in the kind of legal space around the litigation, there was a mediation that was taking place to try to find compromise. And that mediation in the beginning included lots of different parties. But ultimately, it reached this point at the end of last year where a small group of parties, along with the government, along with the Bonneville Power Administration and folks from the Department of Energy and the White House, started having what's called a, quote, private caucus, effectively what amounted to a backroom conversation where instead of all the stakeholders in the region being part of the conversation, just a small group of stakeholders were in the conversation. And they started to reach agreements on things that were good for the small group of participants. Some of the states of Oregon and Washington, who have been oddly supportive of breaching these dams, as well as some of the tribal nations. And so this memorandum of understanding calls for all sorts of mitigation measures and works towards spending about $370 million in Bonneville Power Administration money, which was ratepayer money, which is co-op consumer member money, and talks about some kind of $2 billion Columbia River restoration project, the funding of which is totally unclear. And for us, these dams are a critical source of reliability. So we looked at this kind of backroom deal as a huge threat that undermines reliability in the region.
And so has this backroom deal turned into a proper sort of formal memorandum of understanding yet, or is it still just something that's being worked on?
No, there's an MOU that has been signed by the Bonneville Power Administration with the tribal nations in the two states. But folks from the administration said, oh, well, these were thoughtful, constructive conversations. Well, the White House held a signing ceremony for this memorandum just last week to kind of try to make politic out of this issue, which is odd to me because what we're talking about is reliable power supply. These dams, the Bonneville Power Administration, the Snake River dams, this is the economic backbone of the region. Ensuring reliable, affordable power shouldn't be something that we make on political whim or in back rooms. It should be a discussion that's had over and over. And let me say one more thing about that memorandum of understanding. White House officials before Congress kept saying over and over again, nothing in these agreements breach the dams. That's true. It doesn't breach the dams. Only Congress can breach the dams. But what this memorandum of understanding is intended to do is make it so economically unfeasible to maintain the dams, to make the utilization of the power from these dams so minimized that it would make better sense to pull them out. Don't take my word for it, right? If you want to read the memorandum of understanding, I'll give you 2 data points that matter. The memorandum of understanding said the word breach 22 times. So if the memorandum doesn't intend to breach, then why do they keep talking about it? But more importantly, if you breach the dams, this is 3,000 megawatts of power that's gone. You need replacement power. And that memorandum of understanding talks about replacement power 25 times. So if you don't intend to breach the dams, then why do you need replacement power?
Yeah, no, it's sort of laughable for them to try and make that case on one side and sort of have it both ways. So NRECA and the groups that we're working with and have sort of common cause with, we mobilized fairly quickly after this broke as a news story late last year. Talk a little bit about What case did we make, and where have we made that case?
Scott, let me add one more point because it kind of goes to the heart of this, right? We've talked about $370 million. We talked to about $1 billion. So let me add one more pile of money on it. Senator Patty Murray from Washington and Governor Jay Inslee of Washington commissioned a study and a report on what it would take to replace the power from the 4 Snake River dams. And their report, not by me, this is their number, was another $31 billion. This MOU assumes $370 million, another $2 billion, but that's before you start talking about replacement power of $31 billion. So I mentioned earlier that we started hearing noise about a year ago about there being some kind of traction in this litigation. We started working collaboratively with the statewide organizations in the region to start educating consumer members. The platform we used to do that was Voices for Cooperative Power, which is NRECA's grassroots platform. So we started both delivering educational content and started doing a little bit more recruitment to get more consumer members to opt in to Voices for Cooperative Power so they can both stay informed and be in a position to activate when and if there was ever a time that we need to activate them. So when all of this activity started in December, we kind of grabbed back to our Voices for Cooperative Power advocates in the region and said, for last year, we've been talking to you. We're hearing that there's this backroom deal that the White House is working on. Now's the time to carry your voice. And so we did a petition drive where 14,000 consumer members across the region carried their voice to the president to say, stop, don't do this. This is bad for our community. This is bad for our economy. We can't afford to have this. Don't breach these dams and don't make a secret backroom deal. And we're going to continue to do that. As efforts proceed in the policy arena, whether it's rulemakings in the administration or whether it is legislation in Congress, which there are legislative vehicles that are starting to develop, we're going to continue to use Voices for Cooperative Power in collaboration with our 50 plus co-ops in the region that receive power from Bonneville, as well as the statewide organizations, to carry a message of this is bad for us. This is bad for our community. This is bad for our economy. And it's not just us saying that, whether it's the grain industry out there or the shipping industry out there, two big economic drivers of the Pacific Northwest economy, they're saying the same things. It's not just us.
Yeah, so, and you mentioned that there's maybe some legislative avenues. How long is this going to drag out? What are we asking the administration for? Do we want them to renegotiate or we want them to just scuttle this whole thing?
Ideally, we'd like them to scuttle this whole thing, but realistically, Scott, I don't think that's going to happen. Once you step out with something like this, you obviously have kind of made a decision that this is what you believe and these are where your ideological principles lie. We firmly disagree. And so there are two paths this is going to take now. One is Congress is going to put brakes on this. And there are a couple of different ways to do that. They can put a provision in a larger package that says, no, none of the funds here shall be used to implement this memorandum of understanding. I think there's 3 or 4 different legislative vehicles that have been proposed by different members from the region. And we're going to continue to work with the delegation in the region to do that. We're going to really use our broader advocacy toolkit, right? Direct advocacy from NRECA and our members to elected officials. We're going to really continue to educate consumer members so that they are carrying their voice. We're going to amplify this through the media, which we've been doing on both broadcast and in print. There was a great op-ed that ran in the Spokane newspaper yesterday, I believe, that was signed by Congresswoman Kathy McMorris Rogers and NRECA CEO Jim Matheson, really laying out the argument for why this is a bad deal. And then we're going to kind of make all sorts of noise every place we need to do that. Now, this requires a lot of partnership in the region with our members, but in the last place is, unfortunately, you never want to be in a situation where you've got to undo policy in the courts, but I expect that that's where we're going to land. There is already litigation that is developing from one of our partners in the region, the Public Power Council. They're going to go right after BPA, who's the signator on this. I expect NRECA to be supportive of those efforts and work with the Public Power Council and their efforts here and work with our members in the region. But we're not going to stop there. We're going to look for other opportunities to shed light on this, to hold agencies accountable for the administrative process. We'll look at other litigation. There's a pending lawsuit in the federal district court in the region, and I believe it's in Oregon, that has been brought by the attorneys general of Montana and Idaho to try to put the brakes on all this. And as this issue continues to develop and evolve, Scott, I expect that there'll be more legal maneuvers and more litigation, and we're going to be watching closely and working hand in glove with our members in the region to try to advance their needs.
Well, I mean, it seems like it's moving fast, and it seems like you guys have a handle on it, just what you needed, another top-level political crisis to deal with. I appreciate you coming on and giving us the lowdown on what's going on and where you're headed.
Well, and Scott, let me say one last thing on that. This is a huge priority for us. I want to really make sure folks understand that different regions of the country have different resources and different needs, and NRECA is always going to be there for all of our members, no matter what their circumstances are. And we fight lots of different issues in different parts of the country, whether it's wildfires in certain parts of the country or work with our members in the Southeast as it relates to hurricane restoration. This is a huge threat to the economic viability of our co-ops in the region. And we're going to be at every turn, at every door, making sure that we're working.
I appreciate it, Lewis. Thanks.
Thanks, Scott.
Let's pause here for a word from our sponsor. And when we come back, we'll talk to Fall River Electric Co-op CEO, Bryan Case.
This podcast is supported by NRECA Broadband, a specialized service offering that helps electric co-ops succeed in the broadband business. NRECA Broadband has regulatory and legislative staff dedicated to representing co-ops' broadband interests through direct advocacy. The program also offers robust education and networking opportunities, as well as resources to help participants navigate this complex industry. Visit cooperative.com/broadband to learn how together we can help shape the future of rural connectivity.
I'm Kanan Sharp with Canadian Valley Electric Cooperative in Seminole, Oklahoma. You're listening to Along Those Lines.
Welcome back. Members of Fall River Electric Cooperative in eastern Idaho get about 85% of their power from Bonneville Power Administration, which relies on the 3 gigawatt capacity of the lower Snake River dams to supply and balance the massive federal Columbia River power system. CEO Bryan Case has been deeply involved in the fight for sensible policy regarding hydropower in the Pacific Northwest. And he joins us today to give us a real-world look at what it would mean to the region if these dams were breached. Bryan, welcome to the podcast. Thanks so much for coming on.
It's a pleasure to be here with you today.
So why don't you start off with just a high-level look at Fall River Electric. Where are you located? What does your territory and your membership look like?
Sounds great. Fall River Rural Electric Cooperative serves in 3 states. We're Southeast Idaho primarily, so Victor and Driggs, around the Ashton area, Island Park. We serve West Yellowstone, Montana, and just a little bit into Western Wyoming. So pretty diverse area that we serve. We've got about 20,000 meters. We started business in 1938 and slowly grew and expanded into those areas, but a very diverse group and a fairly large geographical area that we cover.
So what is Fall River's connection to the lower Snake River dams? I know you're not all that close to the dams, but you do have a very critical connection to them. Talk a little bit about that.
We do, yes. Fall River has been purchasing our power from Bonneville Power Administration since about the 1960s. So we've enjoyed a great relationship with them. We would get our carbon-free power from those hydro facilities in the Northwest along the Columbia River. Fall River has small little hydros that we operate on that same Henry's Fork Snake River drainage. And so very connected. We've enjoyed that relationship. It's allowed us to have reliable, low-cost power. And that carbon-free aspect, it's becoming increasingly more important as we look at the future and the impact of carbon.
I want to talk a little bit about that. Late last year, there was reporting that came out that the administration had reached some sort of backroom deal to settle or to put off a long-running lawsuit over the dams. When you saw that come through, what was your first thought about the reporting that you saw?
Surprised that agreement had been made. We were concerned about these discussions in Washington, D.C. with the plaintiffs. There just wasn't any process where the stakeholders were able to participate, be involved, hear the other side's concerns. And so we were excluded from those negotiations. Essentially, the deal was struck, and then we were given that deal, at least the agreement, the essence of that agreement. And for a period of time, asked to keep that confidential, which we did. But it was quite a bit of a surprise. Now, we've been working in the Northwest to find solutions for hydro operations in conjunction with salmon recovery and mitigation. We thought that was working well. And so it was a surprise, and it brought a lot of uncertainty into the mix as we're looking at the next 20-year contract with Bonneville Power Administration. And it does impose this risk that is kind of unmitigated and really poorly defined. Does give us quite a bit of concern as far as the impact to rates to our members. Bonneville has come out and said the rate will be very low impact, but we've had estimates as high as 40% increase in wholesale power costs based on the uncertainty and the risk that's been identified.
Yeah, and people need to know that they're going to get power when they need it. It's 24/7, 365 industry. So the way you read the memorandum of understanding, the administration is saying this is not about breaching the dams. But if you sort of read between the lines, does it seem to you like this is a pathway to breaching the dams?
I didn't count how many times it talked about creating some new generation and giving tribes the funding to build some generation to replace the lower Snake River Dam. So maybe the word breaching isn't in there, but replacing that power is in there, and it's referenced multiple times. So I have a hard time with that concept that, oh, don't worry, we're not talking about breaching the dams, but the conversation and included in that MOU is power intended to replace the lower Snake River dams, which does cause us concern. And here's why it causes us concern. That polar vortex in January is a great case study. The Northwest was at risk of rolling blackouts. The lower Snake River dams generation was increased to meet the demand that was placed on the system. They actually came to the rescue. And if you replace that kind of generation, always available hydroelectric carbon-free generation with wind and solar, during that polar vortex, the wind dropped off immensely. It came down significantly. It was barely registering. And so we couldn't count on the wind generation. Solar, of course, as you've got a polar vortex going down, solar resources aren't that abundant either. Hydro, carbon-free generation, came to the rescue and met the need that was there in the Northwest so we could avoid a rolling blackout. That's one example. We've had several of those in the last few years where the lower Snake River dams specifically have come to shore up the Northwest power grid and make sure that we could provide the power when needed.
So we've been talking mostly about the power generation from these dams, but there are other ancillary effects of these dams, navigational benefits, recreational benefits. Is there anything in your territory, any knock-on positive impacts of these dams that you would not want to see go?
First and foremost is the carbon-free nature of these lower Snake River dams. Southeast Idaho, we're concerned about the environment. We've been blessed with reliable, low-cost power, but a big selling point of that has been carbon-free. And so as the world wrestles with carbon-free generation, we've been blessed in that regard. As far as our ability to deliver products to ship worldwide, that navigation feature you mentioned earlier is important to deliver Idaho products to the world. And currently, the Snake River is used for barging. If those dams are removed, that means that those products would have to be shipped either via railroad or semi. And of course, the carbon impact that would have would be significant. Again, a lot of ancillary benefits to having those dams in place for us.
Having read the memorandum and knowing this issue so well, what are the worst case scenarios that present themselves under this current agreement over the next, say, 5 or 10 years?
Really, this is going to take some time to play out, but the impact, maybe it's alteration to the river system itself as far as when we can generate power and when we have to spill water. They've been doing some of that already, and that's had an impact on the availability of power. We've had to go out to the market to buy additional resources. And in fact, as we come up to this next contract with Bonneville Power Administration, our allocation of that tier 1 resource of the hydro system will be impacted as we spill more over the spillway as opposed to generating power. So there will be impacts that we will see immediately. Again, it may be longer term where the risk and the concern kind of creeps in. Our biggest concern is if we're going to think about replacing this power, where do you build that generation? Solar, wind, what type it is, how do we integrate that? And then how do we firm that up and back it up? So if we have a polar vortex scenario again where the wind's not blowing and the sun's not shining, how do we supplement that resources? A lot of people will say, well, we'll put batteries in place. But when you have a storm that lasts, a couple of weeks, batteries just will not cut it. So those are our concerns longer term. I think Jim Matheson's been doing a great job, and some of those talking points are just making sure that we have a reliable system, that we make a smart transition to a carbon-free future. And in this case, just a smart transition using the lower Snake River dams, looking at the impact to salmon and the mitigation that has been put in place. Public Power would argue that those mitigations have had significant benefits. We've seen improving stock returns. And again, NOAA, when they look at adult returns, they're really looking at ocean conditions, not river operations for adult salmon returning. If you look at the carbon impact, if we had to do something else, really In total, the lower Snake River dams do provide a great value, carbon-free, and we do keep a close eye on adult returns, and that is important to us. We invest significant dollars, and we see value and benefit to that investment.
Your members probably know this better than anyone, but a significant part of their electric bill is devoted to ensuring that the salmon runs stay open.
Yeah, about $1 million a year from Fall River ratepayers. So for us, and we're a fairly small utility, but $1 million is a sizable amount of fish mitigation that happens every single year. And when you look at salmon return and fish returns in the Columbia River, there have been significant improvements in the returns of fish population. The counts and the analysis shows that those investments are paying off and returns are improving. Now, those returns vary by year, again, based on ocean conditions, a lot of factors going on. In fact, most of the factors are primarily related to climate change type events.
Do you see an answer to this problem that satisfies everybody's needs? Do you and your board and your membership have conversations about where it is right now and what the problem is and how to make it better?
We do. In fact, we sent out an email when the deal was struck. We asked our members via email to really look at the website, and NRECA provided a link to support the lower Snake River dams. As part of that email, we included the studies that were available. So there's a 3-year, $50 million study that NOAA and other government agencies invested. There was robust peer review, so the analysis was done. Universities had an opportunity to challenge the analysis, to ask questions. There was a robust public comment portion where anyone concerned with the situation could make comments. So for Fall River, we look at that. It's the final record of decision for the EIS for the Columbia River study. That study concluded that removing the lower Snake River dams was not the best solution and that they should remain. There have been other studies since then. All of those have come back saying that removing those lower Snake River dams would probably not be a wise decision at this point. And again, maybe technology improves. Maybe there's some advancements that in the future that's a possibility. But we're basing it on science, the best available science, and the most robust study that has been completed most recently. And that's where Fall River gets his position. And we do appreciate NRECA and Jim Matheson. They've been out on the forefront. They've studied this issue and have been very supportive, and we appreciate that.
It does seem like another one of those issues where the desire is there to do the right thing, but the administration and the environmentalists are pushing too fast to ensure reliable 24/7 power.
Yeah, and again, who doesn't want to improve the environment we live in and give back and actually improve salmon stocks? We've dedicated significant dollars, time, and energy and resources to that endeavor. So I think we're coming all from the same desire, maybe different approaches, and that's where the disagreements end up being. But I think they are trying to accomplish some good things.
Well, Bryan, you're on the front lines out there, and I wish you all the best because you are advocating for your members. You are advocating for reliability in a situation where it's becoming more and more difficult to do so. So thank you for coming on and telling us about the issue.
Thank you, Scott. Appreciate the time.
And thanks to you, our listeners, and to our sponsor, NRECA Broadband. For more on this and other podcasts, visit us on electric.coop. Until next time, for Along Those Lines, I'm Scott Hoffman.
I'm Emily Hamill from Hendricks Power in Avon, Indiana. Thanks for listening to Along Those Lines. Subscribe and rate us on your favorite podcast app.